A preacher is 1. An idea, 2. A word, 3. A voice, 4. A man. At first glance you might think that all of the above is a kind of oratorical silk hat that could set just as formally on the head of a university lecturer. There is, however, a deep chasm of difference between lecturer and preacher. It is not quite the difference between a dry textbook and a rousing hymn book, but it points in that direction. While the two trails may sometimes cross, the prime purpose of the lecturer is to inform, while that of the preacher is to inspire. The lecturer tells you what you did not know, the preacher tells you what you ought to do. It was summed up best by that preacher who said, "When I stand in the pulpit, I want to make the indifferent people different." Different, presumably, from the casual Christians, or the practical pagans that live on every street. The concerned preacher holds high the banner of faith, and calls for believing souls to rally round it. Though he knows that this sad world is by and large enemy territory, he speaks out fearlessly because he knows that the power of God stands behind him. It is something like that incident in ancient Libya where, far out on the desert, there was quartered a tiny Roman garrison. One day the cavalry of a barbarian army came pounding toward it. The Roman commander stood in front of his little squad of men, traced a line with his sword across the sandy soil and said, "Here is Caesar's. Pass this line, and you attack the Empire of Rome." The barbarian chieftain, whose force could have annihilated the small outpost, reined in his horse and swung his troops off in another direction. Behind the resolute preacher of God's word rises up the might of the Almighty. As the representative of the Lord and the attorney who pleads the case for Christ, the preacher knows that justice and right are on his side, and he need never cut compromising corners. He must speak out as clearly and confidently as a trumpet. If God is behind him, and the congregation literally in front of him, the preacher automatically becomes the middleman between God and the people. And if the power of God is to give muscle to his words, the lives of the people will provide topics for his talks. For this reason he must mingle among them, be part of them, never hold himself aloof from them. They will not eagerly hear a preacher who lives in an ivory tower and delivers his sermons from a library ladder. Exit the ineffectual intellectual. Only in a stained glass window do you see a gorgeously robed Christ preaching to 3 or 4 radiant figures in picturesquely attentive poses. Read the Gospels themselves, and you find Christ in the midst of the crowd, the peasant crowd, sweaty and breathy and weirdly fragrant in the days when deodorants were still far beneath the horizon. Clerical contact, to be sure, need not be that intimate or physical, but into the homes of his people the good priest goes and learns about their lives. He gets to know them, but not like the postman, who gets no farther than the mailbox. The good pastor goes into the very heart of the home, where he sees at first hand their struggles and their problems, their sicknesses and their sorrows, their disappointments and their discouragements, their secret worries and their unspoken dreams, their unexpected little joys, their high hopes and their deep fears, their whole little world that revolves behind the window curtains. A priest who knows his people like this will be listened to. His every word will be illumined by the bright lantern of personal experience and will be warmed by the glowing fire of an understanding heart. New York's Harry Emerson Fosdick, whose voice from the Riverside Church's pulpit was for years as familiar and famous as the carillon from its tower, felt that his main job as a preacher was not to illuminate a subject, but to move an audience. Wherever possible, he liked to give the impression that his sermon was an animated conversation between pews and pulpit, with him, to be sure, playing both roles. For illustrations and stories, he borrowed from the portrait gallery of history. Facts about the famous, he maintained, furnished appealing and persuasive arguments for the man in the street. It flattered Mr. Ordinary and induced him to try to do likewise himself. Another well-known preacher of our day was Dr. James Pike, the late Episcopal Bishop of San Francisco. Anyway, Bishop Pike is unusual because he complained that in the seminary he had been coached into acquiring an elegant style. His reaction against this was so great that in his mature years he repudiated writing as a tool for the preparation of a sermon. This soars up, like a kind of Eiffel Tower exception, among the attitudes of most great preachers. Note, however, this. Bishop Pike did not reject preparation, but his preparation was mostly in the head, or in the words he fed into the tape recorder and then listened to. He might write the talk after he had delivered it, often polishing it for publication, but you get the impression from his lectures on preaching that writing was not a heavy gun in his oratorical battery. He laid more emphasis on the delivery. Bishop Pike had the strange conviction that if you thought deeply and intensely about your Sunday morning sermon before you went to sleep on Saturday night, the dough put in the oven before going to bed would turn out to be pretty good biscuits in the morning. This seems first cousin to the theory you sometimes hear about learning a foreign language by putting a tape recorder under your pillow and absorbing the material while you sleep. Personally, I would hate to bank on it. But don't deceive yourself that Bishop Pike dozed himself into an eloquence that consistently filled his cathedral. In preparing for a sermon, he first read and read and read and scribbled all manner of notes and spoke endlessly into his recorder. To make himself prepare, he always had the theme of next Sunday's sermon announced in this Sunday's bulletin. That way he could not grow lazy and reach back into the bin and offer the rerun of an oldie. The announced title also piqued the curiosity of the people. Bishop Pike always claimed that somehow people with the very problem he was going to discuss on the following Sunday would saunter into his rectory during the preceding week and give him the ammunition he needed. Could it not be that the topic announced in the bulletin had been a subtle invitation? Archbishop Fulton Sheen would discourage, if not dismay, the average priest in the area of sermon preparation. It is said that for 7 Lenten sermons he spent a total of 400 hours. This works out to 8 hours a day for a full week. That total, to be sure, included the many hours spent meditating upon his theme. In fact, he smilingly subjoined that after the planning and the thinking of the topic, there remained only one trifling detail, the writing. Most of us will just watch such an eagle spiral into the sky and enviously wave him to the heights. The Archbishop, though, is in fine company with a couple of cardinals. Cardinal Manning in his eternal priesthood, and Cardinal Gibbons in his Ambassador of Christ both emphasize the importance of the remote as against the immediate preparation. They maintain that if a man had been a good student in the seminary and was now a studious and prayerful priest, then from the twin fountains of his knowledge and his piety would flow extemporaneous sermons that would be simple, direct, and moving. Far be it from a sparrow to dare to disagree with these high-flying hawks, but I must confess that though my theological training was reasonably adequate, and my present goodwill hopefully genuine, that word extemporaneous, even in its broadest connotation, gives me oratorical chills. I can only confess that after nearly 5 decades of preaching, if I were called upon for a sermon on short notice, I would either gratefully unwrap the mummy of some ancient effort, or would offer my high regards and deep regrets. Undoubtedly there are those that can come up with an abrupt and on-the-spot masterpiece, but I know I shall never take my place in that bright and blessed band. Or, as the fellow said, what we need today is more men like St. Teresa. Father, James Gillis could make research look like spontaneity. He was that famous Paulist who shared the coast-to-coast radio program Catholic Hour with Fulton Sheen back in the 30s. He was also the crusading editor of the Catholic World. In those days, the latter was put down, at least in my Philistine circle, as being written by and for school teachers. By that we meant it was prissy and proper, dignified, didactic, and alas, dull. Father Gillis' ambition was to lift it to the literary level of a Catholic Harper's or Atlantic Monthly. Everybody I knew read it for the editorials. Father Gillis scorned the editorial we. He came to battle bearing before him the straight steel lance of the perpendicular and responsible pronoun, I. In those days, most Catholic magazine writing was pretty, a sort of embroidered piety, as dainty as a Japanese. Painting on silk. Father Gillis came along with hammer and chisel and carved his opinions on stern, strong granite. In his hand, a pen lengthened out into a bayonet, and a typewriter began to rattle like a machine gun. Often he stood alone in his opinion as on some isolated hill, holding out against the popular view of the moment. Reactions against him were at times so bitter that he offered to resign as editor so as not to embarrass his fellow Paulists. To their credit, they declined. But after 10 years as a speaker on the Catholic Hour radio program, he was abruptly dropped. They never told him why, and he told me it hurt him to the heart. I have sometimes thought that when he, the best known of the Paulists, and St. Paul himself met in heaven, they probably compared wounds. They were both fighters. With both, it was go or stop. They knew no amber for caution. Father Gillis' theory of preaching was simple. He never worried about such questions as, what will the clergy think? Or, what will the highbrow critics write? But only, will it hit home in the pews? He could have been profound and erudite, and polished and subtle, so that arty admirers would have swung the perfumed censer of adoring flattery. But the people needed what was practical, and he was determined to serve the people. He prepared for his sermon by reading, but that reading meant anything except sermon books. These left him faintly nauseous. A treatise from a theology textbook, a chapter from history, a few articles from the encyclopedia, such were the kind of logs he tossed on the fire that was always blazing in his brain. As he read, he wrote furiously rapid notes, setting down facts from the books, and jotting down ideas that leaped into his lively and fertile mind. Usually he found that he had gathered too much material, so the first order of business was to discard the second-rate surplus. Then came the job of arranging the rest in a persuasive and climactic order. The only thing he really wrote, in the sense of polished sentences, were the connectives between the various arguments, like the couplings on a long freight. At this point he would read and reread his copy, and then read and reread again, and perhaps again and again, all the while pacing and thinking and thinking and pacing. Finally, he would thrust the crumpled sheets into a desk drawer and head for the church. Personally, it would not be enough for me. I would have spent my time memorizing the manuscript as well as I could. But to Father Gillis, memorizing meant mental paralysis. It seems that way back in seminary days, when he had stood up to speak in public for the first time, the speech he had memorized went completely out of his head. He stammered, blushed, and left the platform utterly humiliated. At his next attempt the following month, speaking with a faraway look in his eyes as if he were reading from a distant page, he reached the third paragraph, and then suddenly everything went blank. A month later, when his turn came again, feeling there was nothing to lose, he tried a completely different tactic. He wrote the speech, and read it over and over till he felt it had sunk deep into his brain. Now he could tell himself, "I am master of my topic. I do not need memory." To his surprise and delight, he found that he could confidently stand on this preparation as on a solid platform and speak out fluently and fearlessly. As a matter of fact, his classmates broke out into enthusiastic applause. Now the young Gillis knew. From that day he never memorized and never felt the least stage fright. He went on to become one of the nation's most sought-after speakers. And the moral? Perhaps the scriptural, "Let him who can take it, take it." For myself, once again I admire from afar, and eat my heart out with envy, and go on to plod the humbler, prosaic path of almost slavish memory. God made us all different. Here, not as a model, but merely as a diffident suggestion, I offer the method that suits me. You try it at your own risk, with no warranty attached, no money-back guarantee. I begin by trying to think myself empty about the selected topic. When I was younger, it was easier, and the ideas used to build up like water rising behind a dam about to burst. As they come, you scribble them down. In later years, the thoughts just trickle in, and the tendency is to panic and wonder if you will ever come up with anything at all. The next step is go to the files and judiciously copy the best items you have culled. After that, I may look up several books that deal with the theme and copy down more facts or quotations or examples or illustrations that I may encounter. By this time, from my own mind, plus previous clippings already stored up and from various authorities or source books, I have a couple of typewritten pages of mostly one-liners, suggestive rather than exhaustive. Looking over the material, I shall probably find that it divides itself by content into different divisions or headings. Suppose, for example, the topic being worked up is the abuse of liquor, or, for brevity, let's just call it drink. I find I have something about the causes of drink, something about the effects, something about the victims, something about the remedies. On the margin, I write a bigger alongside any material relating to the causes, B for effects, C for victims, and D for remedies. Then I collect on another piece of paper all the A's. I try to figure out their best logical order, and so grade them as a 1, a 2, a 3. I do the same with the B's, C's, and D's, then I transpose them all in the right order to a final page. By this time there is a complete skeleton of a talk that needs only to be fleshed out or upholstered with smooth sentences and vivid details. Many preachers, I feel sure, would shake their heads sadly over this method, pointing out that I am driving the car in reverse. They mean that I first gather the material, and only then from it deduce and devise a sketch. They themselves would opt for the exact opposite procedure. They would say it is more logical to design the sketch first, and then go out and get the steel beams and the cement blocks for the building. As we used to say in my native Brooklyn, you pays your money and you takes your shirts. The beauty is that both ways work, if the worker is willing to work. Having decided on a topic, you can begin by either going after pertinent material or by sketching out a plan. It really should not divide us into Montagues and Capulets, or Guelphs and Ghibellines, or even Thomists and Molinists. Do we not enjoy the glorious freedom of the sons of God, which is another way of saying that oratory is, after all, not an exact science, and there are few things in these chapters that I would defend passionately. Perhaps only 3. The need of preparation before a talk, unity in it, and a clear diction when presenting it. All the rest is just fringes and tassels. But that rest can be what makes it oratory. the difference between the merely acceptable and the utterly enthralling.